hello, and welcome to another episode of In Progress. So, I'm very excited today. We have a new to our audience author on the show, Hanna Kim. So, thank you so much for being
Hi.
here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you write.
Hi, thanks, Julia. First of all, I'm so excited to be here. I was really excited when Julia first asked me if I could be on here. So, again, super stoked. But my name is Hanna Kim, and I am a children's book author and also a full-time middle school English teacher. And I'm from Michigan. I currently write everything from picture books, chapter book series, middle grade, and YA novels.
Wow, that's a pretty wide range. Hello, Anita. So, it's so great to have you on. Today, we're talking a little bit about multiculturalism in writing. But I want to know, first of all, how did you get your start as a writer, especially being a middle school teacher? I can't imagine you have a lot of time.
Right. It's quite an adventure. But yeah, I was always, I think, really into writing. Even when I was a little kid, I loved writing stories in elementary school. I had an amazing teacher in fifth grade. Her name was Mrs. Jones, and she was really into writing and reading, and she really pushed for that. So I think that's when I kind of started enjoying writing.
Nice.
And then I did some creative writing classes in high school and college. But to be perfectly honest, I never really thought I was a strong writer. I was not really confident, even though I really enjoyed it. And I don't think I ever imagined myself writing professionally. So it was kind of just like something I enjoyed, but it was more of just a hobby.
Mm.
And then when my husband and I were dating in college, he was writing a bunch of books. Like he was always a writer. He wanted to go into that. And as I was watching him and kind of just sitting on the couch watching him write, I think that kind of pushed me to actually write my own book.
Oh, nice.
So
Yeah.
that's actually how I really started writing, was when he started writing and I was watching him. I was like, I
Right.
should just try writing a book too. And I tried writing a few drafts, nothing really stuck. But then one day I got the idea for my first manuscript, which was Markley and the Lunchbox. And it was really heavily based on my own personal experiences. And I think that's what really drove me to continue writing it. And
Mhm.
really, I think that's how I started to get into writing more seriously.
That is so amazing. One, that you have a partner who also writes and it didn't get competitive or toxic. It actually
Right.
encouraged you to write. I think that's so awesome. And two, like I love that, I think a lot of us struggle with imposter syndrome, but I love that you were just like, you know what? Now's the time to try. And
Yep.
you didn't let your first like manuscript that you like the first draft that you didn't finish like stop you, because I feel like a lot of people like have the desire, but they kind of like get stuck in a draft that's not the right draft for their first book that they're going to finish.
Right, right.
So I love that you kept going, and yeah, just congratulations on
Thank you.
being so resilient in the face of imposter syndrome. Were there some things that like really helped you kind of get out of that mindset of I'm not a writer, even though you obviously are writing and love to write?
Yeah, so again, because with this book especially, it is so like a lot of people will ask me like, is this a biography? Because
Mm.
you can really feel how personal it is. And even though it is about a third grade boy
Mm-hmm.
um, in elementary school, it is just so heavily based on just how I grew up and things like
Right.
that. And so I think that because I felt so strongly about this book and I felt like this story had to be told, I was able to push that imposter syndrome aside because I'm like, I need to tell this story. So that was
Yeah.
actually what drove me to continue writing it.
Right, and that's the perfect segue into our kind of topic of the day, which is multiculturalism in writing. I know, like, I try to view it as like a bonus to me because we have different experiences we can draw from
Mhm.
and share, but it can definitely also be a struggle. So, what has your experience been writing this book? Because I know for me, it was very like, it was almost like writing about multiculturalism and all of that was like so personal to me. It was
Mhm.
hard for me to tap into it. So I
Right.
actually wrote a trilogy before I wrote a character that was half Korean like I am.
Okay.
Because it was like I had to almost like go through the process of writing a novel and characters that were a little more distant from me
Right.
before I could dive into okay, I'm ready to write about my culture and stuff too. So what was your experience like?
Right. That's really interesting that you say that. I kind of agree with some things there. There were definitely a lot of struggles just from writing it in the beginning to even now with having this book fully written and getting agented from it. But originally, I thought it was just really difficult to write because the book itself is talking about the trauma I experienced from
Mm-hmm.
elementary to high school. So I was talking to a lot of people about it. I was kind of almost like unwrapping the things that I've hidden away, these memories
Right,
that I've hidden away.
right.
Um, and not to really spoil, but it's based on lunches that I brought as a child.
Mm-hmm.
They were Korean lunches. And I actually really did throw these lunches away, these lunches that my mom spent hours prepping in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually living with my mom at the time when I was writing this because it was kind of around COVID time. And I just remember like writing and then I just felt really emotional and I just apologized to her because
Mm-hmm.
I remember the trauma of, throwing away those lunches, but also remembering when she found out that I was throwing away those lunches,
Right.
probably the pain that she felt, which I didn't understand at the time. But, thinking back, it was probably really painful for her too. So, yeah, it was really difficult reopening that trauma. But again, I just thought it had to be told. The story had to be told, and there are people
Oh,
experiencing this
absolutely.
too, right? Um, and also, not seeing people like me in books or media, it kind
Mm-hmm.
of discouraged me as a writer when I was first writing it. But it is really inspiring to see that there are more Asian American authors and they're getting recognition, and you can see their books in libraries and things like that.
Right.
So that's also really exciting. Something that I would say I'm struggling with now, even,
Mm-hmm.
is that, and I talked to my agent about this too, is that sometimes I wonder if multiculturalism in publishing is just a trend.
Mm. Right.
Because right now it's like everyone wants diversity, everyone wants these multicultural stories, but I feel rushed in a way because I'm like, what if this is over soon? Like they don't want these stories
Right.
anymore, or they just want one of each type of story. So if I see a story that's similar to mine that gets published, I'm kind of nervous or anxious on the inside because I think maybe like they might not want my story anymore because they already found something similar.
Right, they've got that box check. I can
Right.
definitely relate to that because I feel like growing up, because I think we're pretty similar in age. If
Mhm.
not, I might be a little bit older than you, but I think for our generation, like we didn't have Asian American representation in a lot of stuff until like American Girl, you know what I mean? Like came
Mhm.
out, and then that only lasted for a very brief time, and then it was kind of like, okay, we're done with we're done with
Right.
that. And I didn't read a lot of books that had like Asian characters in it until probably college. So it
Mhm.
does feel like it's something that's new and maybe won't last very long. I mean, I hope it does because I think representation is so important,
Mhm.
especially because like for us to have this feeling in general, I of the problem that we had growing up that we didn't see characters like ourselves in a lot of media.
Right.
Um, I know like writing in English is a struggle, but like, do you ever incorporate Korean into your writing as well, or?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't write Korean books, but I
Hmm.
definitely incorporate Korean into my English novels. I
Right.
think that, yeah, actually, every single manuscript I've written so far has included Romanized Korean in it.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it just kind of made sense for me personally when I was writing it because, certain characters should be speaking Korean because they come from this Korean American background, or
Hmm.
I'm writing currently I'm writing a YA novel and it's set in historical Korea. So it makes sense for me to include these cultural elements or food or names in Korean.
Right. And one thing that I love about, having the representation is it is reflective of daily life. Like I
Right.
know, I recently lost my mom, but when she was around, it was just like, you code switch, you go in between English and Korean and go back
Mhm.
and forth. And so not doing that in novels feels like a kind of forced reality, like for for us. So I love that you incorporate Korean. I do have to ask though, because I know it was a very common convention to use italics for foreign languages in writing. And I believe it might have been your tweet about it that really opened my eyes on why there's a good reason not to use italics. So do you want to go into that?
Yeah, that's funny. I was going to mention I
Yeah.
did tweet about it, and I did not expect any real reaction to it, but it did spark this whole debate about, should it be in italics or should it not be? I just personally never thought it needed to be,
Right.
italicized unless there was a really specific reason, like maybe two words are really similar, or something like that. But really, I don't think it's necessary because I just think that italics can make words seem foreign or othered or different. When really in the
Right.
story to these characters, it's just a natural part of how they speak. It's just another language. It's just another form of writing to me. So that's why I personally didn't think it had to be italicized.
Right, and I love that there's a whole concept of othering that minorities and face all the time, and so I didn't even like it was so ingrained that it's just
Mhm.
like of course we italicize, but then when I thought about it, it was just like no, because like to the character, it's not foreign, it's a part of their daily life to like hear this language, and so I just
Right.
really love that concept of like no italics for that.
Right.
Um, But I imagined when you wrote the tweet, you didn't think that it would be like that eye-opening for other character or for other people, but it was just like, yes, I loved it.
No,
Do you,
no.
yeah, do you have any specific advice for others who want to write about different cultures?
Right. So if you are like from a cultural background and you want to write about your own culture, I would say to definitely start by drawing from your own experiences because I think that's when you really get the raw, authentic content. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that like I said, I'm writing a YA that's set in historical Korea, and that's obviously not really my own personal experience. But I always start like the starting point is always from my own personal experience or something I've seen, because I think that again, that's where you get that really authentic writing. It feels close to home, and I just think that the story flows more naturally.
Yeah, I love that advice. It's not the same as write what you know because it's not only writing what you know, but like you said, it gives life to words when it has that spark of
Hmm.
lived experience to
Right,
it.
right.
I really feel you really feel the authenticity and the genuineness in the situation. What would you say to authors who maybe are writing a different cultural background? Write what you live. I love that. Yeah.
So, writing about different cultural backgrounds, especially now, I think is extremely tricky and
Mm,
something that, writers in general are really cautious about.
right.
And that's not to say that I don't think you should write about other cultures. I think that I'm personally really open to that, and I think that
Hmm.
it's important that we write about other cultures, even cultures we're not from. But it's been said, but just doing your research, I do research for my own culture. I
Right.
just want it to be accurate as possible. And something that does bother me is when writers just don't take the time to check or double check, to make sure something's accurate, and it really does show. It does show in your writing. Um,
Mm,
and an example also is when people talk about racism, but they're not including people of color,
hmm.
that feeling of like you're kind of trying to help us, you're trying to diversify, but you're also not taking into consideration what we're thinking. So
Hmm.
I personally love it when writers come to me, like people will DM me all the time and just ask me to look over something. And
Sensitivity readers,
right,
yes, are
which I will say
huge.
is different from demanding that someone
Yes.
read something, which I've also seen. But just asking, seeing if they have time to look over something, I think that a lot of people will be open to that if you just ask. And
Mm,
it it also helps to ask more than one person because there can be lots of different viewpoints from one
right.
cultural background. So yeah,
Right.
just really getting as much information as possible.
Yes, I definitely advocate for that, and I recommend sensitivity readers for like almost everyone because there's things that you just like wouldn't know because it's not your lived experience,
Exactly.
and then you could accidentally say something that could possibly be insensitive or a no no. Like Oh, I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
It's been a long day.
You're good.
Yeah, but no, yeah, definitely. Like, I love that, like you said, you research for your own culture, because I do the same. Because it's like, we have our experience, but it's like, of course, we still want to be respectful and authentic.
Right.
And so, like, we're even going to research like our own culture, because like, even because we live in America, what we know is still a little bit different than people living in like non-diaspora, so like in the
Mhm.
motherlands. So it's like, even like we're doing research, and like even for American stuff, like sometimes I have to like research stuff, because it's like, I'm
Yes.
not from this city, so what is their dialect for this word, or whatever. So I love that, like, research is always your friend, and sensitivity readers are a really great asset that you could have. And don't be afraid to pay people for their time. You know what I
Definitely.
mean? Like, for sure. Like, I know with a lot of beta readers, like, we can, with beta readers, you don't always have to like pay for them, because they're getting access to our books. But when we're asking people to do emotional labor, I do like to pay people for their time. But um, my next question, I guess, kind of is like linked to that a little bit. So, how do we avoid stereotypes, caricatures, and other problems? So, it's really great to have diversity, and we want to have a diverse cast of characters in our books, but we don't necessarily want to write about a struggle that isn't our own. So, what
Right.
is like one way, what are some things we can do to avoid some of the pitfalls? Like, do you have like tips on research, or like other things we can keep in mind?
Yeah, so I mean, you just kind of brought up an interesting point is like when you're writing a story that's not yours. I again, am pretty open to people writing about cultures they're not
Mm,
from, as
yeah,
long as they're doing their research and have sensitivity readers. But I do think that certain stories have to be told by the people who've lived it.
right.
Like with mine, with the lunchbox and that whole
Mm-hmm.
experience growing up in that trauma, I personally just really don't think that someone who hasn't gone through it or someone who is not from my own cultural background could tell that story because
Right,
you just didn't experience all that trauma.
right.
Now it's different when you're just including characters who are diverse. And again, that goes back to just doing your research, getting the sensitivity readers,
Mm.
things like that. And sensitivity readers, you can find them on Twitter, you can find them
Mm.
just online, like you can just do a Google search. I found mine on Twitter. So, they're really there is a lot out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I love to research, or to interview people for research anyways. Like, when I was writing A Scene Set in Egypt, I interviewed my friend who's half Egyptian, and it's
Okay.
just like, it makes the research so fun, because you can ask
Mhm.
questions and like get to know, like, what does a day look like, with day to day, and get like different information than you would just googling something. So I
Right.
really love interviewing people anyways. But yeah, interviewing some about some of their culture is like so fascinating. So
Hmm. Hmm.
I really recommend that for people. So, how, as a writer, have you found your multiculturalism? So, writing about Korean culture, writing whether it's the trauma or maybe the more happier sides of it, has made your writing richer.
Yeah, so I would say it made my writing richer because, again, because I'm taking from my own experiences and cultures and culture, I think it just adds this extra layer that wouldn't exist without
Mm-hmm.
multiculturalism. And it's a big layer, there's a lot
Right.
to it. And so it plays a huge role in the plot, in the characters, in the dialogue, and really everything. So, which is why I think most of my books have multiculturalism in it because
Mm,
it's such a big part of my identity and
right.
just my experiences and it adds so much to my writing, that extra layer that I really couldn't imagine writing something without that element there.
Yeah, I love that, because like one thing I love to do is write about like access culture through foods.
Hmm.
So in my young adult series, it's the first book is Half Blood Alliance. So I have her talk about like banchan, and
Yeah.
like eating whatever for breakfast, not breakfast foods,
Mhm.
and like all accessing some of the culture through food. What are some different ways that you just like represent that in your writing for obviously if your young adult book is set in Korea, I can imagine that it's kind of immersed in the story, but what are some examples?
Right. I relate to the food for sure. I think food is just such a, especially like with Korean culture too,
Right,
there's
we want
so,
to feed everyone,
right.
yeah.
There's so much with food. The food is just also just fantastic. So I want to
Yes,
share
yes.
about the food. So definitely food. I have one story that it's a chapter book series and it focuses on like hanboks and Korean history.
Mm,
And so clothing or
yep.
I've been getting really into Korean history. It's funny because I used to fall asleep during every Korean history lesson that my mom would give me. But now I'm like doing all my research, asking her
Right.
all these questions, and yeah, it's just kind of cool to see like how different things are, how similar things are,
Mm.
with all these different cultures. And also, I don't, this is kind of off task or off topic, but
Oh yeah.
I'm collabing with another author and we're writing about the same story, but from two different cultures. So it's also kind of cool to see how different cultures can have similar stories. So that's
Right.
something that I've kind of been getting into too.
Yeah, what I love, for example, Korean Cinderella,
Right, right,
the story is like really, really, there's a lot of similarities to the Cinderella story we know in the West, but
right.
it's like was completely developed on its own. And there's
Yeah.
even she loses her slipper. So
Mhm.
it's really funny how like there can be parallels, even though it's like two different stories. They still have similarities and stuff in that, and I love that.
Right.
Um, let me see. I do want to ask you just about your writing process in general.
Mhm.
So, are you a plotter or a pantser? First, we'll start with that question. I love asking people that
I know,
question.
I
Like,
get this
tell me your
question.
dirty secrets.
I do get this question all the time, and I don't know what to say sometimes because it does depend sometimes for the story.
Right.
Like sometimes I'm writing a picture book and it'll just kind of come to me and I'll write it that night. I'll
Yeah.
write a draft that
Hmm.
night. But I would say in general, I do plot my big ideas.
Right.
And so sometimes like I'll do chapter by chapter. Sometimes I literally use the plot diagram from middle
Oh,
school and
okay.
high school. That's why I tell my students, I'm like, see, I use this all the time. So sometimes I'll use that just like when I'm initially outlining or drafting.
Right.
But then I would say in general, after that, I'm pretty much a pantser and my story goes all different routes. So
Right. And that's what I always tell people. I'm like, you can plot ahead of time and then change your
yeah.
mind and
Mhm.
like adjust as you go. Like,
Right, right.
so because I'm one of those writers, like I have probably kind of a similar story to you where I always was writing, but I
Hmm.
never thought of myself as a writer. And
Right.
then when I decided to do it, when I decided like this is what I want to do as my career and this is what I want to do with my life, it's my purpose. Yay, a plotter. I know me and Anita are like um, but yeah, like I knew I had to finish something first because I
Right,
have
right.
like in college I went to college for creative writing and English, and so it's like I had started 4 or 5 novels and just never really finished anything. I'd kind of get a really good full steam ahead start, and then kind of it would peter away because I didn't know what was happening next,
Right,
let
right.
alone the ending. So it
Hmm.
kind of like I'd hit that middle and just like kind of lose steam and crash. And so for me, like finding my writing process was like a huge part of my journey as a writer.
Hmm.
And I find that it's like constantly evolving and it's different for different series and it's different for different books in that series. And so I'm really interested to know whether like your process or your thinking of your process is different, like when you're writing, like obviously when you're writing like picture book versus your like young adult novel, but like how different was even like the chapter books to writing young adult novels or middle grade to young adult?
Right, definitely. With my picture book, again, those kind of come really quick. Like I'll
Mm,
just think of an idea and I'll kind of just write something down. And then after that, I'll kind of organize things. With the chapter book, middle grade, and YA, I tend to do, again, start with that plot diagram and then I'll plan out chapter by chapter. So
okay.
that's that way I know like what am I starting with and what am I ending with, because if I don't have an end, I realize that I get really distracted, kind of like you said. So I
Oh
need to
yeah.
know how I'm gonna finish my story. It just gives
Right.
me a good goal. Again, do I really stick with that 100% of the time? Absolutely not, but it's still a
Mm-hmm.
good guideline.
Right. One thing that I like to do is sit down with a goal. So, like, whether
Mhm.
it's like I want to develop the relationship between these two characters, or I want to introduce this plot device or foreshadow, like sitting down and being like, okay, this is what I'm doing with this chapter. Like, if I know nothing else, that helps me
Yeah,
at least to not get writer's block.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah, I love that too. So that really helps me. But I would say, so you talked a little bit about your process, and I love that it's a little bit of plotting, a little bit of pantsing.
Mhm.
Um, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit because I'm very curious. Like, writing a picture book is kind of one of those things. It's kind of like making like pastry, where it seems like, oh, or making bread, like, oh, this should be easy.
Mhm.
I just need to, it's mostly pictures with, a few,
Right.
cutesy words. And then you go to do it and you're like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my
Right, right.
life. So what is writing picture books like for you? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people, yeah, definitely think picture books are easier because they're so short, but it's just different. Like the steps are
right.
different. Like I said, I can write a picture book in a night. Like I'll write it in a
Hmm.
few hours. But the revision process can go on forever.
Oh, I
I
bet. Yeah.
Yeah, I had this idea for a book. I wrote it in I think an hour or under an hour, super quick. And I slept. It was like during like at night I just had this idea in bed. And when I woke up, I was like, "Oh my gosh, there's so much revision I need to do."
Right.
And it's
Right.
because every single word really matters, and every
Mm.
single word has to really fit, like the rhythm or every
Hmm.
single word is just has to be important because of the word count. So I go back and change like words, just finding synonyms for things sometimes,
Right.
changing the phrasing
Right.
over and over. So I guess the actual writing part of it, the first draft might be simpler, but yeah,
Right.
going back and doing that, the revision process is
I feel like it's kind of like writing poetry where you have like less
Mhm.
words to work with, so they have to have more impact. And even if you're not rhyming your picture book, like you said, there's still a rhythm to it. There's still a flow,
Mhm.
and yeah, and like nailing that is like not easy to do. And
Right.
so like you think like or even short stories where you're like, oh, it's only 10,000 words. How hard can it be? But when you have so little words to work with, it's
Mhm.
like it's 10 times harder. So
Yep,
um,
definitely.
definitely can relate to that. What would you say is the big difference between writing like middle school versus young adult? Like, what do you feel are the big differences in those?
Yeah, so I mean, I teach middle school, so I kind of know where their headspace is.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel like middle grade and just writing for middle school in general is really more about like self exploration,
Mm-hmm.
understanding your own identity. Those are the themes I see. So I guess the themes are different. While with YA, they kind of go into more specific themes. So with my middle grade novel, it's talking more specifically. It's like a coming of age, like
Okay.
daily experiences of a
Right.
kid kind of navigating life. While with the YA, it's going into um, like careers. It goes
First for
into
people.
sexual
Hmm.
assault, like deeper themes that you wouldn't really find in a middle grade novel.
Right, right. You get to kind of go more in depth and explore first for people, like first loves, first big
Right.
feelings for things, and what they want to do with the rest of their life. They're supposed to know. So you're
Right.
somehow supposed to know when you're like 16 what you're going to do with the rest of
Right.
your life. Um, what would you say are some of your biggest influences in writing?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm saying this over and over, but just my own background and experiences
Right.
have been
Hmm.
such a huge influence. I think again that's kind of what helped me get my start with writing in
Hmm.
general. Um, my family, they've been super supportive throughout my writing, and they've actually really helped me too because they know more about Korean culture and whatnot. So
Mm.
they've
Yeah.
definitely had an influence in that way. And also just seeing the future generation, seeing the middle schoolers, seeing when I was teaching second grade and kindergarten, seeing them, it really made me want to write more because I just see the experiences that they go through or just
Right.
seeing their mindset and wanting to, you know, wanting to give them something that would, give them a new viewpoint or teach them something.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one thing I always say, reading teaches empathy because it
Hmm.
teaches us to see something from someone else's perspective.
Right.
So I love that you just said that, because it's like, it's so true. Like, why do we want to write? Because we want to like teach a different perspective to someone,
Definitely.
and and shape the way they see the world that way, that they can
Mhm.
see something from someone else's point of view. I really, really love that. And yeah, I think it is inspiring when you do work with younger people. Like, one reason why I kind of find myself drawn to writing young adult personally, is because like I do love, like you said, like writing about identity and discovering who you are and versus who you want to be.
Mhm.
I really love exploring that. But I also really like love creating good role models for people.
Right, right.
Um, and like because some books don't have the best role models, where it's just like, my boyfriend left me, so let me lay in bed for 3 months. Like, I'm not going to name the book, but I'm just like, let's be more Leia Skywalker,
Yep,
where it's
yeah.
just like, my man got kidnapped and put in carbon, like, I'm getting him back.
Right, right.
But we do have a question from the chat, so let's jump to that. So I'm gonna,
Okay, sounds good.
yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Something you learned in your research about your culture that you didn't like really know, until you did your research, and that you can definitely use in the future.
Oh shoot.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
I
what's
was gonna
something
think
that
of
you
the
learned,
question.
yeah, in your own research about your culture that you didn't know, but you can use in the future?
Yeah, so again, I did not know much about history in
Hmm.
general with
Hmm.
Korean history. So I was able to I felt closer to my culture when I was
Mm,
doing research on Korean history. And actually, when I got married, I did something called a pibik, which is like a
love that. Yeah.
traditional Korean marriage ceremony. And because of the research that I did for the Korean history, I learned more about like hanboks, like the more traditional wear,
Mm-hmm.
the traditions that, they celebrated, things like that. So yeah, I think I've recently just been doing a lot of research on Korean history. It also helps me understand why Korea is the way that it is right now.
Mm.
So it's just been really cool kind of connecting all those things based on my research.
Right. There's something in Korean culture that's like kind of deeply ingrained in the culture but not talked about. There's two things. Like, one, there's nunchi, but there's also han, which is just
Yep.
like, so Korea has had a lot of struggle and strife in its past. And so
Right.
there's this kind of ingrained sorrow called Han.
Mhm.
If I'm explaining it very well,
Yeah,
I know
you
I'm not.
are.
But that was something that I learned about, that it was just kind of like, it was something that you grew up like kind of sensing under the surface, but not
Mhm.
really understanding until you learn more about the history and like why it's called the Hermit Kingdom, and
Definitely.
why, all the little nuances of like what's happened in the past. But I love that you bring up hanbok, because like, I know it's like when we watch K dramas and we see the
Mhm.
old Joseon, dress, and we're just like, oh, it's gorgeous, but like, little things have meaning on the
Right.
clothing that we
Everything is
don't
meaning.
even realize as like the general audience, unless you do research into that. So I really love that. Do you want to share a little bit about the Pabek ceremony, for people who don't know like what that
Yeah.
involves? Or yeah,
Yeah.
if you're
So we did.
comfortable with it.
Yeah, we didn't do all the traditions, but
Yeah.
it was really amazing because my mom made all the traditional foods.
Oh,
Like
I
she
love
made
that. Yeah.
japchae and bulgogi and like
Yeah.
all this chun. Like she did a really fantastic job. We wore all the traditional wear, including like
Mm-hmm.
the headdress and whatnot. And we do this thing where we hold this like long piece of cloth, and then the parents will throw
Mm-hmm.
dates, and
Yeah.
that's like the amount of children you'll have. It's just, it's something
It's
that's
just a fun
very
part of the
fun. Yeah.
ceremony. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Did he do the piggyback or
we did
no?
do the piggyback. Yeah.
Ah! I'd be so nervous, like, don't drop me.
Right, right. I was a little nervous, and that the dress is huge
It's
for
so heavy.
the
Yeah.
pivot. So yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a totally new experience. I've never worn anything like this, and
Mm.
it feels like it is my culture, but like something I've never experienced before. So it's just a really cool
Right. No,
overall experience.
that's amazing. Yeah. So, and I know that's like a very like becoming more and more popular to do kind of a dual ceremony for Korean
Mhm.
Americans. So, like you do like the traditional wedding and like the
Right.
white dress, and then you change into hanbok and do the fun throwing dates and catching them in
Right.
your in your stuff. So I really love that you did both, because I know that's like, especially like with big Korean populations, that's like very easy to do like public and all that stuff. But you know, in Michigan, it can be a little harder.
Oh
But
yeah.
there's definitely like a nice community here, like you can find. So I'm loving that.
Yeah, I will say it was impossible to find that humble for the
Oh yeah,
that's like a million people to get it. But
right, because you don't wear like normal hanbok. You
oh yeah,
wear like the, princess empress
yeah,
style,
mhm,
and the big headdress and all that stuff. Yeah.
right,
Oh my gosh, I can imagine like just walking around like you've got like 20 pounds in the
yes,
chima
yes,
alone, and then so I'm loving that you did that. But getting back into writing a little bit, where do you find inspiration? That's a question I really love to ask my guests, because I think everyone finds inspiration in a different way. And so I love finding new ways to find inspiration from people. So, like, what inspires you? Where do you find your inspiration?
yeah. So I find it through so many different things. I
Mm,
find it through other writers of color. Again, when I thought that I would never find a story where, someone like me was represented.
mm,
I saw authors like, Linda Sue Park or like Katie Zhao, just so many authors
mhm,
that showed me that, you can get a story published where a character is Asian American. So
mhm,
definitely other writers of color. And I will say it's just such a great community of authors too, because ever since I first joined Twitter or like said I wanted to be a writer, they have welcomed me with open arms and were so generous with,
yeah.
just, like to me, they're just like super famous and I look up to them. But, the fact that they gave me advice and just have supported me, it was really, really exciting and
Yeah,
encouraging.
that is super
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah. I love the writing community in general, because it's just like everyone shares information and resources
Right.
that are so valuable. And like when you really like start writing and you don't know anything, it's just like, oh, it's so nice to like be able to just be like, what am I doing? I don't even know what I
Yeah,
don't know.
definitely.
And getting help and support for that is so amazing.
Right.
So I mean, anything community, I'm just like, where are my people? Like, where's my
Same.
community? I love it. um, so so other writers inspire you. And
Yeah.
I know you mentioned a couple of them, but like are you one of those people that's like crowd watcher, listen to conversations, spark ideas from that? Do you find inspiration like watching movies, other media,
Mhm.
reading books, like um
Yeah, definitely other books. And I know you mentioned food, and food is also,
yeah.
strangely a big source of inspiration for me. Just day-to-day life when I go visit my family or,
Mm-hmm.
when we went to Korea, that was my first time and I was I think that was not that long ago. I just graduated college and that was actually my first time going. And I was like, I need to come back here because it's really
Oh
different actually being there, even though
yeah.
I grew up very culturally Korean. It was definitely different being there. So that was a huge source of inspiration for me too.
Oh, for sure. I went when I was 21, and I made the mistake of going. So my mom didn't teach us how to speak Korean growing up,
Okay.
because one of my sisters, my auntie's teachers, had said like, if you teach her Korean, she'll never be good at English, kind of thing.
Mm,
It was the 80s; they didn't know what
I
they were
see. Yeah.
talking about. And so it was just like, I learned in college, but like when I went to Korea, the opportunity came up, and of course I took it, because I had been as like a young child, didn't even remember being there, and I
Hmm.
always wanted that connection. And
Right.
so like I went when I was 21, I took the opportunity, but like all I knew was like basic introduction, like, hi, I'm a student, like,
Right.
and so I didn't have like access to the language. Luckily, I was mostly in Seoul, where everyone
Mhm.
knows English anyways, but I was
Right.
just
Right.
kind of like, had this wonderful experience, but I'd love to go back with my sister, especially because like now that I know a little bit more about the language at least and can like understand
Mhm.
people conversationally better, I'd love to go back and just experience it again. And it's just like it's just exciting to be there. It's in Seoul, especially, is like a huge city, and it's just like gorgeous mountain, I
Yes.
loved it. Yeah, it's really funny. And everyone was like, "Did you get culture shock?" And I was like, "Actually, no. It was so
Yeah.
nice meeting people that like look like my mom." And
Yeah.
like it just felt like, oh, everyone's family.
Yeah, I agree.
So I loved that. It was not culture shock. It was just like, oh, everyone's family. But what is your favorite writing advice? I'm sure you've heard lots of advice, especially being a middle school teacher, but what is your
Mhm.
favorite writing advice to give?
Uh, so I was thinking of writing advice I've been given, but to give
Mm.
to, I think, is to really work on the voice, like focus on the
Oh.
voice, because I think you can have a great plot, but if the voice isn't there, it's hard for the reader to connect to your story.
Mm. Mhm.
And a really good voice, I think, is really what puts your book like above anything else. So,
Gotcha.
yeah,
Mhm.
I've always been told, focus on the voice, make sure your voice is clear, that it's powerful, that it's relatable. So I think anytime I'm writing a book, I just make sure that, that's there for sure.
Right, and that your voice is authentic to each
Right.
character that you're writing in a new story.
Yes.
Do you have any like tips for like how you write your voice really well? Because it sounds like you think about it a lot. So I'd
Right.
love to
Oh,
hear
I
your
don't know
tips.
if I
I'm
I
putting
mean,
you on the spot, I know.
no, it's still, something that I'm just trying to work on. Um, again, like just thinking back to your own experience, because again, that's where you get the most authentic voice.
Mm.
And I think like reading other novels where there is such a strong voice, that I think that's really helped me. I love
Right.
Linda Sue Park, and she's kind of one of my favorites and someone I look up
Okay.
to. But her voice is in each of her books, the voice is so strong. So
Mm.
anytime I read her book, I feel like I'm just inspired too.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you like to write first person or third person better?
Oh, this is something that I struggle with all the time.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I've gone back and forth. So my first book was first person. I
Mhm.
changed it to third person, went back to first person. And
Right.
then the novel I'm currently writing is in third person. So I do think it depends on the story,
Mhm.
because the first book was about that lunchbox moment and I wanted
Right.
people to really feel these emotions. I think that's why I chose first person
Oh,
ultimately.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but again, I kind of think it depends on the story. Um, I do like third person, and I think
Right.
it flows really well. But
Right.
when it needs to be really emotional, or you need to,
Mm.
you know,
Mhm.
feel that experience, I think first person works well.
Yeah, and I love that I know exactly what you mean when you talk about lunchbox trauma,
Hmm.
especially as a Korean person. And uh, you know, I think it's something that a lot of first generation children can understand. Being children of immigrants and just being like the first person to deal with American culture on top of the your culture at home, and just
Right.
the stark difference between the two sometimes. um I know I know you said it was kind of painful for your mom. I think it's painful for our parents to see us going through it as well,
Hmm.
as feeling their own pain
Yes.
for the sacrifices that they're making, and you not being able to fully like comfortably appreciate it. Yes, Anita, I love that. First person works great in shorter fiction, especially flash
Hmm.
fiction. I do find that different stories definitely lend to either first person or third person. I know I love third person because I just get really bad imposter syndrome when I'm writing in first, where I'm like, because first person, I feel like the character cannot be annoying. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
that's true.
because you're in their head, you don't want
Mhm.
them to be annoying, or else no one
Right.
wants to read the book, right? So then I put that pressure on myself when I'm writing first person to be like, is she annoying? Like, let me let me look
That's
at my
so
character
true.
and be like, what am I doing with her? Like, is she just like the worst person in the world to be in their head? Um, But like when I find myself writing certain stories, I'm like, no, let me just relax a little bit and write this in first person, because I feel like, certain stories do need to be told through the eyes of that person,
Right.
and a little closer. So we know your favorite writing advice to give is to focus on your voice. What writing advice do you hate?
That's such a good question.
I love asking that question. I'm like, tell me your controversial hot takes.
Right, hot take.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say this is for me personally, but
Mhm.
I've been given this advice so many times, and it was that to just push yourself to keep writing. And the
Right.
reason why I don't fully love this advice is because I really do think sometimes you need to take a break. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this might just be me, but I do jump from story to story.
Right.
So I'll be writing a story for a few months and then I'll take a break and write another story and then kind of bounce back and forth. It just works for me personally because I don't like to. A level of force needs to be there, but I also don't want to
Right.
drag myself to write something. And sometimes after that break, I feel refreshed and I'm ready to look at it with new eyes.
Yeah, you don't want
So
to get bogged down in one story or
right,
one scene that you're struggling with, and
right.
then muck your way through it. And I feel like, especially if you're neurodivergent in any way, that
Hmm.
can kind of be like the worst advice, because
Right, right.
we like, if you're neurodivergent, it's like you already guilt trip yourself when you're not
Hmm.
being productive or you're not being this or that, and it's just like added pressure of like, I'm supposed to be forcing my way through, and I'm have no energy for the day, and I can't
Yes,
even focus, like, how, let alone write, and then you're guilt tripping yourself on top of that because you're supposed to do something. And I always say,
right.
like, don't should yourself. Like, you should never you should never, as I say should, right? But you should never be like, I should be doing this,
Yes.
because
I like how you mentioned scenes too because
mm,
I actually felt really guilty because I just skipped a whole scene in my book for my
right,
YA
right,
and just moved on honestly to the more exciting part for me. And I was
right,
like, I was asking, people, I'm like, is that okay? Like, can I just do that? And everyone's like, yeah, you can just go back. Sometimes it's okay to go to those
right.
parts. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you're motivated again to kind of go back, then you can go back. So,
Right,
yeah.
because your mindset changes all the time. So sometimes when I have like a really an emotion that I'm having a hard time tapping into, I skip it and
Mhm.
move on to the next chapter. And like that's a luxury you have when you have a little bit of plotting too, is
Right.
that you don't have to write in order because you know every scene that you have to write, kind
Exactly.
of. So you
Hmm.
can kind of be like, well, I feel like writing a love today, so I'm gonna write, the love story part, or I feel like writing the super sad, emotionally heavy part.
Hmm.
You can kind of decide what your mood is for that. So
Very
I
true.
love that. And actually, like, that's the advice that I hate, is the write every day, write no matter what,
Hmm.
kind
Hmm.
of mentality. Because like I actually, for my first book, my first two books, but my first book especially, I wrote every day and I edited every day, once I got into the editing process. And I got so burned out. Like
Hmm.
I couldn't look at my writing for like
Yes.
at least a month after, because I was just like so drained and burned out that I was just like, I cannot function. Like if
Yeah.
I'm just pulling up my manuscript, I was just like,
Right.
I can't do this. Um,
I totally relate to that. I had the same kind of
yeah.
plan.
Hmm.
I said I was going to write every day and I had a
Hmm.
word count that I wanted to reach. And I am someone who gets anxious a lot. So when I
Right.
didn't hit that word count, I would get super anxious or feel guilty. And basically every part, like every second of my day, I was thinking about the story because I'm like, oh, I have to write today. So
Right.
I know
Right.
I have to write. So it was making me really anxious and I had to take a break from it. So I
Yeah,
totally
yeah,
relate.
you don't want to damage your mental health in the
Right.
pursuit of something that's supposed to bring joy and
Yep.
good mental health to you. I
Exactly.
love what Anita said. She said that skipping ahead can sometimes spark a new idea too, which is so
Definitely.
true, because you're like, you jump ahead and you're just like, oh, they should do this so
Hmm.
that this happens. And so that's a really great point too. And then I have to ask, so you kind of mentioned this, but like, favorite author book.
This is an impossible question for
I
me.
know it is impossible. It is, but I love. Give me a top three or something.
I have top three books. So
Right.
this is how you know that I love middle school curriculum and
Hmm.
whatnot.
Yeah,
But so The Little Prince is definitely one of my favorites. It's just
that's a
I'm
good
always
one.
learning from it. It's a classic. I love. There's this book called Hidden Talents by David
Okay.
Lubar. I It's funny because he came to my school when I was in middle school as the author of, how they used to do authors of
Yeah,
the year.
yeah.
Yeah, and we recently connected on Twitter, and I told him that, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, I remember going to that school." So it was just really
Ah,
cool. But yeah,
yeah, small
that's
world.
one of my favorites. I love Stargirl, anything by Jerry
Mm-hmm.
Riley. And I know I mentioned Linda Sue Park. She's such an
Mm-hmm.
inspiration to me. So I can't choose. I can't, but
Yeah, no, the perfect response right there. Perfect, perfect, perfect. I guess one add on to that question is, what about those books do you love the most?
mm,
Like for me, like one of my favorite books is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
okay,
I read it in college and it was just like the characters were so great. And I love that she writes about everyday life in a way that you're just like, oh my God, what happens next? Like they're at a tea party, you know what I mean? Like they're having tea, but you're just like,
mhm,
do Darcy and her talk? You know, you're so into it and so like invested in the story when it's just like everyday life. She finds a way to
right,
bring out the drama and make it exciting. And I just love her characters and the wit
yeah.
that they have. So like what about those books do you love so much?
That's such a great question, and I've actually never thought about it before, but now that I think about it, all three books, well, at first I feel like I can learn from them. So every time
Mm-hmm.
I read it, I feel like I'm gaining something new, especially with The
Yeah.
Little Prince. It's like
Yes.
I've read it a million times, but every time I read it, I am learning something new. So that's what
I
something that
love
I
books you can reread. Yeah.
right. And also something that kind of challenges me to think about, my identity, or they're all kind of talking about like it's okay to be, different or unique, or
Mhm.
everyone has their own uniqueness. They bring something to the table. So, now that I think about it, all three of them have that similar theme. So, yeah, I think that's
Right.
what I like too.
And that's one thing that I love about certain books is the life lessons that they
Mhm.
give without being preachy, without
Yes, yes,
kind of
100%.
beating it over your head like
Right.
you are enough, but you read the book and you get that sense of like, oh, I'm enough. Like everyone in this book is enough, and that is
Right.
with me too. So I really love kind of like young adult and like what's called children's literature,
Mhm.
like I kind of love because like they have such a great way of imparting like wisdom and
They do.
lessons on you without being overbearing, and I'm just like
Yes.
I really enjoy that because it's just like I know sometimes you don't always want to read a book with a life lesson or a moral, but they're so good for us too at the same
Right.
time where you're just
And it's
like,
not just a life lesson. It's,
right,
there's
there's
actually a
yeah.
story there, right? Like you said, it's not
Mhm.
preachy. It's, you know.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, I love the genre. I also, strangely enough, so I write horror now, so it's like night
Oh,
and
okay.
day opposite. It's like stark contrast is my life. Like I like to
I love that.
quote Walt. I like to quote Walt Whitman when he says, "Do I contradict myself? I am large. I contain multitudes." So of course I contradict myself. Like so, I like to live that way too.
I love it.
Um, yeah. So we're just going to wrap up now. So I want to give you the opportunity to tell us where we can find you online, if you have any announcements or anything you would like to like share with the audience, and all that good stuff. So now's the time to promote yourself and let us know where we can stalk you.
Yeah, so I'm most active on Twitter, so you can find me on Hannah Kim Writes on Twitter. And I also have my own website, and it's just hannahkimwrites.com. And I just want to thank Julia so much for allowing me to come on to the show, because I always love talking about multiculturalism and writing. And again, it's in all of my books. It's something that, you know, that's my focus, I think, as an author. So I'm just so glad I was able to come on and share about it.
Oh, and we're so happy to have you. Like, I love introducing new people to our audience, and in your insights were just like so great. So HannahKimWrites.com, Hannah Kim Writes on Twitter.
Yes.
And then you did say that you have an agent for your book. So do you want to tell us a little bit about, was it Mark Lee Eats Lunch?
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
it's Mark Lee and the Lunchbox,
Okay.
and all things publishing. I can't always say much, but
Right.
I'm just going to say that there's exciting news in the works for. I have lots of projects coming up, so in the next year or so, I'm hoping that people will see my books on the shelves. So
Yay, yeah.
yeah,
Keep an eye on her website. I'm sure she's blogging about it or something.
yes,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, love it. And then as for me, you can always find me at hijinkswriter.com on most social media, except for TikTok, where it is Ginny and Tonic, JINNY and Tonic. I have kind of exciting news. I have been joining Elle Bachman on her podcast, which is the Dark Jotter Cast. Oh, thank you, Nita. So glad to have you here. And we've been talking about horror and horror stories and movies and all that fun stuff. So check out the Pajama People podcast as well on Dark Jotter Cast. And it was really great show tonight. Really great to have Hannah on. Thank you again so much. And as always, it's always time to go indie now. So thank you so much.